Hello everyone and welcome back to the deep dive. It's been a while since I made a video and my voice might sound a little different because I have a new setup, but hopefully it works well. Today I'm going to be talking about the problem with headcanon. Now, headcanon is a fantastic thing. First, let's go over what canon is. So canon, an idea originally starting with more ancient religious texts, is basically when you have a whole story with many different authors and lots of different side stories going on, and some group or the controlling entity basically makes official which parts are the real story and which parts are, as Disney puts it, the legends that are not really part of the canon story. What this means for Star Wars is that when George Lucas was in charge, pretty much everything was canon. Everything flowed. He had to approve everything personally. Everything went through his own story editors, and all of Star Wars was just one grand story that all pieced together. Sometimes there were small contradictions, but nothing that we couldn't think away with our own fan theories or minor changes. That is the beginning of headcanon. Headcanon is where the official canon does not mesh perfectly with what you want the story to be like. An example of this is when Disney took over Star Wars. They threw out a lot of the old canon, they installed their own version of canon, and they started deciding what is and is not the official story versus what is legends. Unfortunately for Disney, a lot of their official stuff, a lot of people didn't really like. And a lot of the things they labeled as legends and threw out of the canon, those were pretty popular. So what happens is people start developing their own personalized headcanons. And in the case of Star Wars, that means that each individual person has their own particular movies, their own particular shows, their own books, their own video games that they consider to be the actual Star Wars story. And everything outside of that, the ones that they don't agree with, that they don't like, that doesn't fit their vision of Star Wars personally, those are the ones they, for themselves, see as the legends, or not even Star Wars. And with that being as it was, honestly, for the most part, it worked out for most people, including me. Basically, I had my whole George Lucas canon that I loved, that Disney called legends, but to me, it was still the real story. And then as Disney kept making more and more new things, some of them I just didn't like, and they don't fit my Star Wars. And to me, they're not Star Wars, no matter what Disney says. Personally, I'm not a fan of the sequel trilogy, so the sequel trilogy is just not part of the Star Wars story in my head. Instead, that time after Episode 6 is filled with all of the old video games and books and those kind of stories about Luke's Jedi Academy and things like that, which I much preferred. So I still have some Disney things, like Rogue One, for example, is in all of my videos because it's one of my favorite Star Wars movies, but it's mixed in with the old Star Wars legends from George Lucas and creates my own personal headcanon. This worked pretty well up until recently, because everything that I liked from Disney fit pretty well, not perfectly, but at least pretty well into most of what I liked from George Lucas. Until Ahsoka, where now things are starting to cross and starting to make me question things. For example, some things in the Ahsoka show are starting to borrow from the Heir to the Empire book series, which was basically the original sequel trilogy written even before the prequels, and told the ongoing story of Han, Luke, and Leia after Episode 6. Well, now a lot of parts of that are being taken and put into the Ahsoka show with a spin, and connecting them to the other Disney show of Star Wars Rebels, and The Mandalorian, and all of these sort of things. Which means that, for example, the one that hit me the hardest and inspired this whole video, Hera and Kanan Jarrus' son is named Jason, which is inspired by, in the books, Han and Leia's son, who is named Jason Solo. So now, in my headcanon, there are two independent, very similar, young Jedi, rebel hero little boys named Jason, which sure, there could just be two of them, or they could be inspired to name the same name somehow, but even that feels like a little bit of a stretch to me. And so that's what prompted this video, is what happens when one side of the canon and the other newer canon take inspiration from each other and have some weird contrasts and overlaps and internal references as I pull them into my own Star Wars headcanon. It's a fascinating thing that hasn't really happened much, but I suspect it will keep happening to me and other people more and more as Disney starts making better Star Wars content like Mandalorian and Ahsoka and other shows that also slowly approach their sequel trilogy that a lot of people don't like, and gets more and more into replacing, or at least trying to replace, that era of original books about Luke's Jedi Academy and the rest of that time period from the George Lucas version. Now, is this a real problem for my own headcanon? Not really. I mean, for this specific case, for example, even though it kind of shocked me a bit and kind of made me think about things, it's also not that hard to solve. I can just imagine that either Hera's son or Leia's son was born first and named Jason, and maybe the other one heard about that and had their own son and then named him Jason. And Jason might just be a popular name for young Jedi in the rebellion born from rebel hero parents. It could be a thing. It doesn't really break anything. It's just a little jarring to think about, and especially to prepare as it becomes more and more common. Just trying to think, what will I do and what will people do as more of the good parts of Disney start to overlap with, contradict, or contrast with the good parts of the George Lucas Star Wars? Because at a certain point, for your own headcanon, if you want a consistent story, you kind of have to pick one, or you have to go through a lot of mental flexibility to try to mesh them together in a way that you can get behind. Although the more I think about it, the more we've actually had this problem before. The place this problem came up the most was actually from George Lucas himself, because the biggest instance I can think of this particular thing is when two of the best parts of George Lucas's Star Wars had their own contradictions back to back. And by that I mean George Lucas's big 3D Clone Wars animated series that everyone loves, contrasting and contradicting on occasion the old 2D Clone Wars animated series that everyone also loves. When you watch the 2D show and you watch the 3D show, the endings as they lead into Revenge of the Sith don't actually match up very well. A lot of it does match up, like Anakin getting his scar, Anakin becoming a Jedi Knight, the introduction of General Grievous, Anakin and Obi-Wan knowing Ventress. All of those things match up really well. And there's lots of other side stories that just slot in perfectly fine. You can even try to mix together the leading into Revenge of the Sith portion of the 3D version and the 2D version, because the 3D one focuses mostly on Ahsoka while the 2D one focuses more on the other Jedi. But even then, they don't perfectly align all the time. Which leads to the question of, if there's two good versions of a story and you want to keep both of them in your head, but you also want to keep the story consistent for yourself, how do you manage that? How do I manage a Disney Star Wars and a George Lucas Star Wars if both of them have good parts that I want to keep? And how do you manage two versions of the Clone Wars that are both equally good but occasionally contradict each other? Or for that matter, a lot of people have problems with Rogue One because it contradicts a lot of the old video games and books and those stories about how the Death Star plans were stolen. There are so many versions of that story in particular. There's the old Kyle Katarn version, there's the new Rogue One movie, there's the Battlefront 2 version. There are so many stories of this that, honestly, it's funny to me how many theories I've seen of people just saying, well, there were probably more than one version of the Death Star plans and some little pieces here and there, and so there was a lot of different spy missions to grab all the different pieces and bring them together. The lengths that we'll go to maintain these good independent stories that contradict and try to force them into one canon together is honestly amazing, and I kind of love it. But it's so fascinating to think about just for yourself. What parts do you like? What parts do you not like? And how do the parts you like actually come together? How do they form a coherent story? And when they don't form a coherent story and they try to contradict each other, how do you, in your own head, change your views on certain aspects of them to make them fit together so that you can still enjoy the whole thing? And then from there, there's even a larger issue of as we get more and more good things from more and more different sources with less and less care for being consistent, things will contradict more, and there won't be one solid canon because everyone will have their own individual headcanons, which has already basically happened more and more since Disney started taking over Star Wars. How does that work as a fandom? Because if every person has their own distinct version of Star Wars, do we even like the same Star Wars? How do we talk about it? What happens if some people think, wow, this is so amazing, but other people think, wow, that doesn't fit in with my version of Star Wars I had in my head, so I can't even fit it in if I like it? How do we kind of bridge that gap and discuss and make one kind of unified story if everyone has their own separate versions? This is already something that happened a long time ago, not to this scale, but it did happen from the very beginning with A New Hope and then The Empire Strikes Back. Even back then for The Empire Strikes Back, some people were turned off by it because they thought it was too dark and gritty. And other people were turned off by it because they thought it was too similar to A New Hope. And then when you hit Return of the Jedi and the Ewoks, so many people were out. Not to mention the Phantom Menace and Jar Jar Binks and that whole exodus of fans and splitting of headcanons everywhere. But then there's one obvious place that the answer to this question lies, and it's actually something that George Lucas had built into Star Wars from the very beginning. And that place is mythology. Star Wars started as a coherent story, mostly managed by George Lucas, approved by storyboards that all fit together perfectly, or at least mostly perfectly. But as it keeps growing and expanding and going from generation to generation, company to company, story to story, director to director, it's getting so big and so famous and so broad in its scope, and things are getting lost in the mix really fast. And it's ever accelerating how fast things are getting lost and muddled. And it's basically becoming the modern mythology. Everyone has their own favorite characters, their own favorite stories. They might fit together, they might not. But what it really comes down to is what matters to you? What do you personally get out of Star Wars? What do you get out of these characters? What do you get out of these stories? And do you have a headcanon that works for yourself? Once everyone has their own headcanon that works for themselves, everyone feels inspired from the same source material, then we can still enjoy the thing together. We can still appreciate the same thing together, even though in our heads we all have different versions. And the reason for that is because they're all inspired by the same source. Someone who thinks that A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back were the only good Star Wars movies and it's all been downhill since there will probably disagree pretty strongly with someone who thinks that The Rise of Skywalker is the best film ever made. But both of those people, even though I disagree strongly with both of them, and I would debate with them if they wanted, they're still inspired by the same stories, the same source material, and when it comes down to the foundation, they're both still Star Wars fans, even though they're not the same fans of the Star Wars that I am, and they're not fans in the same way or have their headcanons in a similar way that I do. Maybe there's something that really connected with them in their own favorite movies that didn't connect with me, or they just missed something that strongly connected with me from maybe episode 2 or episode 3 or Rogue One or one of my own favorite movies. Everyone has their own personal favorites and personal headcanons because the whole point of Star Wars is that it is the mythology that inspires you, gives you motivation, gives you life lessons, gives you comfort, gives you that sense of awe and wonder, action and adventure. Whatever parts of Star Wars are consistent enough for you and make you feel those enough, that's your Star Wars. And everyone has their own Star Wars. And even though it's sad to see the consistent canon that's closely monitored go, and it's honestly bad for the longevity of the brand to have it fracture so much, now that it has fractured, I'm starting to appreciate better how it functions as a mythology. And in a way, even though it became so big that it broke, By finally breaking in this way, it almost makes it more personal. I have my own Star Wars that inspires me and motivates me no matter what Disney does. And so do you, and so does everyone listening. So, when it comes to Star Wars, when it comes to canon, of course, we should try to push Disney to be as consistent as they can. We should try to appreciate where they take inspirations or connect things back to the old canon as much as possible. But also at the same time, we should appreciate how we each have our own individual Star Wars that works for us, that can't be taken away, and just how incredibly special that is. And it all goes back to the original source material with A New Hope and that original idea of George Lucas that Star Wars is the modern mythology to inspire modern people. So the next time you see some Star Wars thing you disagree with or something that conflicts with your own canon, just remember to take a breath, appreciate your own version in your head, and keep on the lookout for new awesome things that you can add to it. Build your own nest of Star Wars. Just collect all the little twigs of story, and eventually you'll have a pretty nice Star Wars nest of your own. And that's something comfy and homey and something you can share with your friends and family especially. So hopefully this gave you a new perspective on Star Wars and headcanons as a whole. But there's a lot more videos like this on the channel, so definitely go check out my page, see what else you might like, and leave a comment letting me know what your personal headcanon or thoughts on it are. As always, thanks for listening, and may the Force be with you. This is Deep Dive, signing off.